In the darkest days of World War II, when Nazi submarines prowled the Atlantic Ocean like wolves hunting sheep, when merchant ships loaded with food, fuel, and weapons sank beneath the waves faster than anyone could count, when Winston Churchill himself admitted that the U-boat threat was the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war, one man stood in a California shipyard and made a promise that seemed absolutely insane. He promised to build ships faster than the Germans could sink them. He promised to turn shipbuilding, an ancient craft that had taken months or even years to complete a single vessel, into something that looked more like an assembly line for automobiles. He promised to take workers who had never seen a ship before, people who had been farmers and store clerks and housewives just weeks earlier, and transform them into the most productive shipbuilders the world had ever seen. His name was Henry J. Kaiser, and though he had never built a single ship before the war began, he was about to change the course of history itself. While admirals and generals argued about strategy and tactics, while soldiers fought and died on distant battlefields, this businessman with no shipbuilding experience would help win the war by doing something that every expert said was completely impossible. This is the story of how one man's refusal to accept the word impossible turned the tide of the greatest conflict humanity has ever known. Henry John Kaiser was not born into wealth or privilege, and nobody who knew him as a young man would have predicted that he would one day become one of the most important figures in American history. He came into the world in 1882 in a small town in upstate New York, the son of German immigrants who had crossed the ocean hoping for a better life in America. His father worked as a shoemaker, and the family never had much money, struggling just to keep food on the table and clothes on their backs. Young Henry had to leave school when he was just 13 years old, not because he wanted to, but because his family desperately needed the money he could earn by working. He took a job in a dry goods store, sweeping floors and stocking shelves, doing whatever was needed to bring home a few dollars each week. But even as a teenager, Henry Kaiser showed something special, a quality that would define his entire life. He refused to accept that his circumstances would determine his future. He refused to believe that because he was poor and uneducated, he had to stay poor and uneducated forever. Kaiser moved west as a young man, driven by the same restless energy that had brought millions of Americans to the frontier throughout the nation's history. He ended up in the Pacific Northwest, where he started working in the construction business, learning everything he could about building roads and bridges and dams. He watched how other men ran their businesses, studied what worked and what did not, and most importantly, he paid attention to ways that work could be done faster and more efficiently. While other contractors accepted that certain jobs took a certain amount of time, Kaiser constantly asked himself if there was a better way. Could materials be delivered more quickly? Could workers be organized more effectively? Could new techniques replace old ones that nobody had ever questioned? This obsession with speed and efficiency would have seemed strange to the traditional craftsmen of his era, but it would become the key to everything he accomplished later in his life. Through hard work, smart decisions, and an almost superhuman amount of energy, Henry Kaiser built himself into one of the most successful construction contractors in the entire western United States by the time the 1930s arrived. He had worked on some of the biggest and most ambitious projects that America had ever attempted, including the massive dams that tamed the wild rivers of the West and brought electricity and water to millions of people. He helped build the Hoover Dam, that incredible monument of concrete and steel that still stands in the desert between Nevada and Arizona, holding back the Colorado River and generating enormous amounts of power. He worked on the Grand Coulee Dam in Washington state, another engineering marvel that changed the entire landscape of the Pacific Northwest. Through all these projects, Kaiser developed a reputation for finishing jobs ahead of schedule and under budget, something that made him very popular with government officials who were used to contractors who did exactly the opposite. But Kaiser was more than just a good businessman who made money by building things efficiently. He genuinely cared about the workers who labored on his projects, and he pioneered ideas about worker welfare that were revolutionary for his time. When other contractors treated their workers as disposable and replaceable, Kaiser set up medical clinics and hospitals so his employees could get health care. He believed that healthy, well-treated workers would be more productive and loyal, and he was right. This philosophy of taking care of his people would become crucial when he faced the enormous challenge of the Liberty ships, because he would need workers to perform at levels that nobody had ever achieved before. You cannot ask people to do the impossible if you do not take care of them, and Kaiser understood this truth better than almost anyone else in American industry. By the time World War II exploded across Europe in 1939, Henry Kaiser had become wealthy and successful, but he was not content to simply enjoy his fortune. He was 57 years old, an age when many men start thinking about retirement, but Kaiser was just getting started on the greatest adventure of his life. When he looked at the war raging across the ocean, he saw not just a terrible tragedy but also a challenge and an opportunity. He knew that America would eventually be drawn into the conflict, and he knew that when that happened, the nation would need ships, thousands and thousands of ships, more ships than had ever been built before. And Henry Kaiser, who had never built a ship in his entire life, decided that he was going to become the greatest shipbuilder America had ever seen. To understand why Henry Kaiser's achievement mattered so much, you must first understand the desperate situation that the Allies faced in the Atlantic Ocean during the early years of World War II. When Adolf Hitler's Germany conquered France in the summer of 1940, the Nazi regime gained control of French ports on the Atlantic coast, giving German submarines, called U-boats, easy access to the shipping lanes that connected America with Britain. These U-boats, sleek and deadly machines commanded by skilled and aggressive captains, began sinking Allied merchant ships at a terrifying rate. Every ship that went down took with it not just cargo, but also the brave sailors who had manned the vessel, men who died in the cold water or went down with their ships into the dark depths of the ocean. The British Isles depended completely on supplies brought by sea from America and the British Empire, and if the U-boats could sink ships faster than they could be replaced, Britain would be starved into submission without Germany ever having to invade. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister who led his nation through its darkest hours, later wrote that the U-boat menace was the only thing that ever really scared him during the entire war. He understood mathematics better than most people, and the mathematics of the Battle of the Atlantic were absolutely terrifying. If Germany sank 100 ships and the Allies built 90, the Allies were losing 10 ships. If this continued month after month, eventually there would be no ships left, and Britain would have to surrender or face starvation. The German U-boat commanders knew this too, and they pressed their attacks with ruthless efficiency, hunting in groups called wolf packs, striking at night when convoys were most vulnerable, and disappearing beneath the waves before the Allied escorts could fight back. The tonnage of ships being sent to the bottom of the Atlantic grew larger every month through 1940 and 1941, and the shipyards of Britain simply could not build replacements fast enough to keep up with the losses. American President Franklin Roosevelt understood the dire situation perfectly well. Even before the United States officially entered the war after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. He knew that Britain had to survive because if Britain fell, America would face the Nazi Empire alone, and the cost of defeating Hitler would become infinitely higher. Roosevelt pushed the limits of American neutrality by providing as much help to Britain as possible, including supplies, weapons, and ships. But there was a massive problem. American shipyards, like British shipyards, built ships the traditional way, with skilled craftsmen carefully constructing each vessel over many months. This traditional approach produced excellent ships, but it produced them slowly, far too slowly to replace the terrible losses in the Atlantic. What was needed was not just more shipyards, but a completely different way of thinking about how ships were built. What was needed was someone who could look at the ancient craft of shipbuilding and reimagine it entirely. What was needed was Henry Kaiser. The ship that would become famous as the Liberty ship did not start as an American design at all, but rather came from Britain, where desperate naval architects were trying to solve the same problem that haunted Roosevelt and Churchill. The British designed a simple, basic cargo ship that sacrificed speed and elegance for ease of construction. It was not beautiful and it was not fast, but it could be built more quickly than traditional ships, and that was what mattered. The design was based on old tramp steamers that had sailed the oceans for decades, reliable if unexciting vessels that carried cargo from port to port around the world. The British called their version the Ocean Class, and they began building them in British yards, but they knew they could never build enough on their own. They needed American industry, and they needed it desperately. When the design came to America, naval architects and shipbuilders looked it over and made some modifications to suit American construction methods and materials. The resulting ship was 441 feet long and 57 feet wide, powered by a simple steam engine that could push it through the water at about 11 knots, which is roughly 12 miles per hour. This was not fast by any measure. Modern cargo ships could travel much faster, and even during World War II, many vessels were considerably quicker, but speed was not the point. The Liberty ship was designed to carry cargo across the ocean, survive the journey if it was lucky, and do so in numbers so vast that even heavy losses would not matter. Each Liberty ship could carry over 9,000 tons of cargo, enough to supply an entire army division for months, or enough to feed a city for weeks. If these ships could be built quickly enough and in large enough numbers, they could overwhelm the U-boat threat through sheer quantity. The design used welding instead of riveting for much of the hull construction, and this single decision would prove to be both a blessing and a curse. Traditional ships were built by heating metal rivets until they were red hot, then hammering them through holes in steel plates to join the pieces together. This process required highly skilled workers and took a tremendous amount of time. Welding, on the other hand, involved melting metal and fusing the pieces together, and while it still required skill, it could be learned much more quickly than riveting, and it was considerably faster. The problem with welding was that it created different stresses in the metal than riveting did, and if the welding was not done perfectly, or if the steel had flaws, cracks could develop and spread. Some Liberty ships would later break apart because of these welding issues, But this danger was not fully understood when the program began. The designers believed they had created a ship that could be mass-produced, and that belief would be put to the test in shipyards all along the American coasts. Henry Kaiser heard about the Liberty Ship program and immediately saw an opportunity. While traditional shipbuilders worried about whether they could expand their facilities and hire enough skilled workers to build more ships, Kaiser thought about the problem completely differently. He did not see shipbuilding as a specialized craft that required years of training and tradition. He saw it as a construction project, not fundamentally different from building a dam or a bridge, and construction was something he understood better than almost anyone. Kaiser believed that if automobile factories could use assembly line techniques to produce thousands of cars, those same principles could be applied to building ships. The experts told him he was wrong, that ships were too complex and unique to be mass-produced like cars. But Kaiser had heard experts tell him things were impossible many times before, and he had proven them wrong every time. Kaiser formed partnerships with other companies and began bidding on contracts to build Liberty ships for the government. He proposed building shipyards in places where no shipyards had existed before, including Richmond, California, across the bay from San Francisco, and in Portland, Oregon, and Vancouver, Washington, along the Columbia River. Traditional shipbuilders on the East Coast, who had been building ships for generations, were skeptical and even hostile to this upstart from the construction business who thought he could come in and revolutionize their industry. They predicted he would fail spectacularly, that his inexperience would lead to disaster, that his ships would fall apart or sink or prove unseaworthy. Kaiser ignored all the criticism and negativity and simply got to work doing what he did best, which was building things faster and more efficiently than anyone thought possible. The shipyards Kaiser built were unlike anything the world had ever seen before. Instead of constructing ships piece by piece from the bottom up, the way ships had been built for thousands of years, Kaiser broke the ship down into prefabricated sections that could be built separately and then assembled. Different sections of the ship would be constructed in different parts of the shipyard at the same time, with workers specializing in particular tasks rather than having to know how to build an entire ship. This was the assembly line principle applied to shipbuilding, and it required completely rethinking how the work was organized and managed. Kaiser brought in efficiency experts and industrial engineers, people who had worked in automobile factories and other mass production facilities, and he told them to study every aspect of the shipbuilding process and find ways to make it faster. Where traditional shipyards resisted change because they had always done things a certain way, Kaiser's shipyards embraced change and innovation at every level. One of Kaiser's greatest challenges was finding enough workers to staff his massive new shipyards. The traditional shipbuilding industry relied on craftsmen who had spent years learning their trade, often starting as teenagers and working their way up through apprenticeships that could last a decade. Kaiser did not have years to train his workforce, and even if he did, there were not enough trained shipbuilders in the entire country to meet the enormous demand. So Kaiser did something radical. He decided to hire people with no experience whatsoever and train them to do specific tasks quickly. He hired farmers who had lost their land during the Great Depression. He hired store clerks and factory workers and laborers of all kinds. He hired women, which shocked the traditional shipbuilding industry that had always been an exclusively male domain. He hired African Americans and gave them opportunities they had never had before in an America that was still deeply segregated. Kaiser believed that if you broke the job down into small enough pieces, almost anyone could learn to do it with proper training. The training programs Kaiser developed were remarkably sophisticated for their time. Workers would spend a few weeks learning one specific skill, such as welding or operating a crane or reading blueprints, and then they would be put to work doing that one job over and over until they became extremely good at it. This was completely different from the traditional approach, where a shipbuilder needed to understand the entire ship and all its systems. Kaiser's workers did not need to know how to build a ship. They just needed to know how to do their particular part of the process very well. This specialization meant that people could become productive much more quickly than anyone had believed possible. A woman who had been working in a cannery or raising children at home could learn to weld in a few weeks and then become part of the team building ships that would help win the war. The famous image of Rosie the Riveter, the iconic symbol of women working in war industries, could just as easily have been Rosie the welder at one of Kaiser's shipyards. Kaiser also understood that he had to take care of his workers if he wanted them to perform at peak efficiency. He provided daycare centers for working mothers, something that was almost unheard of in the 1940s. He made sure his shipyards had good medical facilities, building on his earlier experience providing healthcare for his construction workers. He paid good wages and provided benefits that made his jobs attractive to workers who had many options in the booming wartime economy. Kaiser knew that building ships at the speed he envisioned would require his workers to be motivated and loyal and willing to work hard under difficult conditions. You could not treat people badly and expect them to break production records, and Kaiser made sure his workers felt valued and appreciated. This investment in human capital paid enormous dividends when the production records started falling, and the ships began sliding down the ways into the water at a pace that astonished the world. When the first Liberty ship was launched from a Kaiser shipyard in 1941, it took about 230 days to build, which was already much faster than traditional shipbuilding but still far too slow to meet the desperate need. Kaiser was not satisfied. He gathered his managers and engineers and workers and told them they had to find ways to cut the construction time in half, then in half again, then even further. Every day that could be shaved off the construction schedule meant that more ships could be built with the same resources. And more ships meant more supplies reaching Britain and more cargo supporting the American forces that would soon be fighting around the world. Kaiser created a culture of continuous improvement where everyone was encouraged to suggest ways to work more efficiently. If a worker on the assembly line had an idea for how to do something faster or better, that idea would be listened to and tested. And if it worked, it would be implemented immediately across the entire shipyard. The improvements came from everywhere. Engineers redesigned the prefabrication process to make the sections fit together more precisely, reducing the time needed for final assembly. Managers reorganized work schedules to eliminate idle time and keep workers productive throughout their shifts. New tools and equipment were brought in to replace slower manual methods. The shipyards operated around the clock, with 3 shifts of workers keeping the construction going 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The yards were lit by huge floodlights at night, turning the waterfront into a scene that looked almost supernatural, with giant cranes lifting massive sections of ships and sparks flying from thousands of welding torches. The noise was constant and deafening, the work was hard and dangerous, but the ships kept coming faster and faster with each passing month. By 1942, Kaiser's shipyards had reduced the construction time for a Liberty ship to about 60 days, a stunning achievement that most experts would have said was impossible. But Kaiser pushed for more. He studied the bottlenecks in the process and attacked them relentlessly. If getting materials to the right place at the right time was slowing things down, he improved the logistics. If certain construction steps were taking too long, he brought in more workers and more equipment. Kaiser had unlimited confidence that any problem could be solved if smart people worked on it hard enough, and he communicated this confidence to everyone in his organization. The workers at his shipyards began to believe they could do anything, that no record was safe, that every achievement was just a stepping stone to something even more impressive. This culture of possibility and ambition created an environment where the impossible became routine. In November 1942, Henry Kaiser decided to prove to the world just how far his shipbuilding revolution had come. He announced that his Richmond shipyard would attempt to build a complete Liberty ship, from the moment the keel was laid to the moment the finished vessel sailed away, in less than 1 week. Traditional shipbuilders thought this was a publicity stunt, a trick that would produce a ship in name only, something that could not possibly be seaworthy or safe. But Kaiser was completely serious. He had his team carefully plan every single step of the process, organizing the workers and materials with military precision. And on November 12, 1942, they began construction on a Liberty ship designated as the Robert E. Peary, named after the famous Arctic explorer. What happened over the next few days was nothing short of miraculous. Workers swarmed over the ship around the clock, assembling the prefabricated sections with incredible speed and precision. Welders worked in teams, their torches creating a constant shower of sparks that lit up the night sky. Crane operators lifted huge sections of the ship and lowered them into place with practiced ease. Electricians and plumbers and painters followed behind the main construction teams, installing systems and finishing touches even as the hull took shape. Every person in the shipyard knew they were part of something historic, and they pushed themselves beyond what they thought they were capable of. The normal construction schedule was not just accelerated but completely transformed into something that looked more like a sprint than a marathon. On November 15, 1942, just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes after construction began, the Robert E. Peary was launched into the water, complete and ready for sea trials. The ship was not just thrown together quickly. It was actually built properly, with all systems functioning correctly, and it would go on to serve reliably throughout the war, surviving multiple voyages across dangerous waters. The record made headlines around the world and proved beyond any doubt that Henry Kaiser's revolutionary approach to shipbuilding worked. America could build ships faster than Germany could sink them, and that fact changed the entire strategic picture of the war. The Battle of the Atlantic was far from over, but for the first time the Allies had reason to believe they could win it not through superior tactics or better technology, but through the sheer overwhelming power of American industrial production. While the production records and statistics told a story of triumph, there was another side to the Liberty ship program that was darker and more troubling. The incredible speed of construction came at a cost, and that cost was measured in human lives and suffering. Shipyard work was dangerous under the best circumstances, involving heavy machinery, high places, and thousands of ways a person could be injured or killed. When you accelerated the pace of work to the levels that Kaiser demanded, the danger multiplied. Workers fell from scaffolding, were crushed by falling materials, burned by welding accidents, and killed in crane mishaps. The rush to build ships faster and faster sometimes led to shortcuts in safety. And while Kaiser genuinely cared about his workers, the pressure to meet production targets meant that safety concerns were not always given the priority they deserved. Women workers faced special challenges in the shipyards, not just from the physical dangers of the work, but from discrimination and harassment in an environment that had been exclusively male for generations. Many male workers resented the women who came to work in the shipyards, believing that welding and shipbuilding were not appropriate work for women. Female workers had to prove themselves constantly, working harder and better than their male counterparts just to be taken seriously. Despite these obstacles, women proved to be excellent shipyard workers, often showing more attention to detail and care in their welding than men did. The Liberty Ship program helped break down gender barriers in American industry, but this progress came through struggle and sacrifice, and the women who worked in Kaiser's shipyards paid a price for their pioneering role. African American workers also faced discrimination, even in Kaiser's relatively progressive shipyards. While Kaiser hired black workers and gave them opportunities they could not get elsewhere, they were often relegated to the hardest and dirtiest jobs, paid less than white workers doing the same work, and excluded from supervisory positions. The shipyards reflected the broader racism of American society in the 1940s, and while the war effort brought different groups of people together in ways that had never happened before, old prejudices died hard. The Liberty ships helped win the war and advance the cause of racial and gender equality in America, but the people who built them had to fight battles on multiple fronts, against both the enemies overseas and the discrimination at home. As Liberty ships began sailing across the Atlantic in large numbers, carrying vital supplies to Britain and later to support the invasions of North Africa and Europe, a disturbing problem emerged. Some of the ships were breaking apart at sea, literally cracking in half and sinking with all hands and cargo lost. In January 1943, a Liberty ship named the Schenectady actually broke completely in two while sitting peacefully at the dock in Portland, Oregon, not even at sea but just floating in calm water. The ship split almost perfectly in half with a loud crack that could be heard across the harbor, and photographs of the broken vessel shocked the nation. If Liberty ships could break apart while sitting at the dock, what was happening to them in the middle of the Atlantic during winter storms? Investigations revealed that the problem stemmed from the welded construction of the ships combined with flaws in the steel and cold temperatures that made the metal brittle. When ships were riveted together the old way, cracks could develop, but they would usually stop when they reached a rivet, limiting the damage. In welded ships, a crack could run continuously through the welded seams, and in the worst cases, the crack could race around the entire ship, causing catastrophic failure. The steel that was being used had too much sulfur in it, making it prone to brittle fracture in cold water. The welders, many of whom had learned their trade in just a few weeks, sometimes did not weld properly, leaving defects that became starting points for cracks. The combination of design issues, material problems, and construction flaws created a deadly situation. Henry Kaiser and the other shipbuilders worked frantically to fix the problem. They redesigned parts of the ships to add reinforcements that would stop cracks from spreading. They improved the welding techniques and quality control. They changed the steel specifications to eliminate the brittle material. These fixes worked, and the catastrophic failures became much less common, but not before a number of ships and the brave men who sailed on them were lost to this design flaw. Critics of Kaiser's mass production approach pointed to the broken ships as proof that traditional methods were better, that rushing to build ships so quickly inevitably led to dangerous compromises. Kaiser countered that even with the losses from structural failure, his Liberty ships were still winning the numbers game, still delivering more cargo and supplies than the U-boats could destroy, and that was what mattered for winning the war. By 1943, the tide was turning in the Battle of the Atlantic, and Henry Kaiser's Liberty ships were a major reason why. American shipyards, led by Kaiser's operations but also including traditional builders who had adopted some of his methods, were launching ships faster than the German U-boats could sink them. In 1942, the Allies had launched about 7 million tons of new shipping while losing about 8 million tons to U-boats and other causes, a net loss that was unsustainable. But in 1943, the Allies launched over 13 million tons of new shipping, while losses dropped to about 3 million tons, a massive reversal that meant the convoy system could not only survive but grow. The Germans simply could not build and deploy U-boats fast enough to keep up with the American shipbuilding miracle. The Liberty ships were everywhere, forming the backbone of the vast convoys that crossed the Atlantic carrying tanks and trucks and ammunition and food, and everything else needed to support the massive buildup of Allied forces in Britain. When the D-Day invasion of Normandy was launched in June 1944, Liberty ships carried much of the equipment and supplies that made the invasion possible. and they continued to supply the armies as they fought their way across France and into Germany. In the Pacific theater, Liberty ships supported the island-hopping campaign, bringing supplies to American forces thousands of miles from home, enduring Japanese submarine and air attacks, and making the logistics of the Pacific War possible. Without the Liberty ships, the Allied victory would have taken much longer and cost many more lives if it had been possible at all. The numbers were staggering. By the end of the war, American shipyards had built 2,710 Liberty ships, an average of more than 2 per day for 3.5 years. Kaiser's shipyards alone built more than one-third of the total. The ships carried 75% of all cargo shipped overseas by the United States during the war. Some Liberty ships made only one voyage before being sunk, paying the ultimate price in the dangerous waters of the war. Others survived the entire conflict and continued sailing for decades afterward, proving that despite the speed of their construction, they were fundamentally sound vessels. The Liberty ship program was one of the greatest industrial achievements in human history, and it demonstrated beyond any doubt that American manufacturing, when fully mobilized, could outproduce the rest of the world combined. Henry Kaiser was not content to rest on his laurels with the Liberty ship program. He was constantly looking for the next challenge, the next impossible thing that everyone said could not be done. Even while his shipyards were churning out Liberty ships at record pace, Kaiser was already thinking about what came next. He proposed building aircraft carriers using the same mass production techniques he had applied to cargo ships, and while the Navy was skeptical, they eventually gave him contracts to build escort carriers, smaller versions of the fleet carriers that could be built more quickly. Kaiser's shipyards produced 50 of these escort carriers during the war, and while they were not as powerful as the big fleet carriers, they played a crucial role in protecting convoys and supporting amphibious operations. Kaiser also got involved in aircraft manufacturing, joining with industrialist Howard Hughes to form a company that would build cargo planes. This partnership led to the infamous Spruce Goose, a gigantic flying boat made of wood because wartime aluminum was scarce, which was supposed to carry troops or cargo across the Atlantic without needing to refuel. The Spruce Goose turned out to be an expensive failure, flying only once for about a mile before being permanently grounded, but it showed Kaiser's willingness to take risks and try new things even when success was far from guaranteed. Not every one of Kaiser's ventures succeeded, but his failures were always ambitious failures, attempts to do something extraordinary rather than safe bets that offered only modest rewards. Kaiser's most lasting contribution outside of shipbuilding might have been in healthcare. The medical program he developed for his shipyard workers during the war became the foundation for Kaiser Permanente, one of the largest and most innovative healthcare organizations in the United States. Kaiser believed that providing good healthcare was not just morally right but also economically smart, because healthy workers were more productive and missed fewer days of work. The prepaid health plan he created allowed workers to get medical care without worrying about the cost, and this model influenced the development of health maintenance organizations and other forms of managed care throughout the American healthcare system. Millions of Americans today receive their healthcare through Kaiser Permanente, a legacy that has probably saved more lives than all the Liberty ships combined. When World War II ended in 1945, the Liberty ship program came to an abrupt. The shipyards that had worked around the clock for years suddenly had no more orders, and the massive workforce that had built the ships dispersed to other jobs and other lives. Many of the Liberty ships themselves were simply parked in vast fleets in harbors around the country, no longer needed now that the emergency was over. Some were sold to shipping companies and continued to carry cargo in peacetime. Others were scrapped, cut up for the valuable steel in their hulls. A few were sunk intentionally to create artificial reefs or used as targets for weapon tests. The great shipbuilding campaign that had helped win the war ended almost as quickly as it had begun, leaving behind empty shipyards and memories of an extraordinary time. Henry Kaiser transitioned to peacetime business with his usual energy and optimism. He started an automobile company, Kaiser Frazer, which produced innovative and stylish cars but ultimately could not compete with the giant established automakers like General Motors and Ford. The company failed after a few years, costing Kaiser a significant amount of money and proving that even his talents had limits. He had more success in other industries, including steel production, aluminum manufacturing, and construction, building on his wartime reputation to secure major contracts. Kaiser developed communities and resorts, including a transformation of Hawaii that brought tourism and development to the islands on an unprecedented scale. He remained active in business until well into his 80s, never losing his belief that problems could be solved and that the future would be better than the past. Kaiser died in 1967 at the age of 85, having lived long enough to see the world transformed by the war he had helped win. He passed away in Hawaii, far from the shipyards where his greatest triumph had taken place, surrounded by the tropical paradise he had helped develop. The obituaries hailed him as an industrial genius, a pioneering businessman who had shown what American enterprise could accomplish when properly motivated and organized. But the obituaries also noted his failures and controversies: the workers who had been killed in his shipyards, the ships that had broken apart, the automobile company that had failed. Kaiser had lived a complicated life, full of extraordinary achievements but also very human flaws and limitations. He had been neither a saint nor a villain, but something more interesting: a man who refused to accept the limitations that others tried to impose on him, and who changed the world through the force of his will and the power of his ideas. Today, few Liberty ships remain afloat. Most were scrapped decades ago, cut up and melted down, their steel recycled into new products, their contribution to history reduced to photographs and memories. But two Liberty ships have been preserved as museum ships, maintained by dedicated volunteers and open to the public so that new generations can walk their decks and try to imagine what it was like when these vessels sailed through submarine-infested waters, carrying the supplies that kept the free world alive. The SS Jeremiah O'Brien, preserved in San Francisco, and the SS John W. Brown, maintained in Baltimore, stand as monuments not just to the ships themselves, but to the workers who built them and the sailors who sailed them and the vast industrial effort that they represent. The lessons of Henry Kaiser's Liberty Ship program remain relevant more than 80 years after the ships were built. Kaiser proved that traditional ways of doing things are not always the best ways, that expertise and experience, while valuable, can sometimes become obstacles to innovation, and that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary achievements when properly organized and motivated. He showed that speed and efficiency matter, that in a crisis, the perfect can be the enemy of the good enough, and that building something acceptable quickly can be better than building something perfect slowly. These lessons apply far beyond shipbuilding, to any industry or organization that faces pressure to do more with less, to work faster without sacrificing quality, to find ways to accomplish what conventional wisdom says is impossible. Kaiser's story also reminds us of the power of American industrial might when fully mobilized for a common purpose. The Liberty Ship program was not just about one man's genius, but about an entire nation pulling together to meet a desperate need. Government officials had to be willing to take chances on unconventional contractors like Kaiser, giving him opportunities despite his lack of shipbuilding experience. Workers had to be willing to learn new skills and work long hours under difficult conditions. Engineers and managers had to be willing to abandon traditional methods and try radical new approaches. Suppliers had to deliver materials on time and in the vast quantities required. The whole system had to work together, and it did, producing results that astonished the world and helped secure victory in the greatest war in history. Behind the statistics and the production records and the strategic impact, the Liberty Ship story is ultimately a human story. It is the story of women who left their homes to work in shipyards, proving that they could do jobs that had been considered suitable only for men. It is the story of African Americans who found opportunities in Kaiser's shipyards that were closed to them in most other parts of American society, even though they still faced discrimination and prejudice. It is the story of young sailors, many still teenagers, who went to sea on these hastily built ships, knowing that German submarines might send them to the bottom of the ocean at any moment. It is the story of engineers and managers who worked 18-hour days trying to solve problems that nobody had ever faced before. It is the story of thousands of ordinary people who did extraordinary things because the times demanded it and because they believed they were part of something larger than themselves. The workers in Kaiser's shipyards came from every imaginable background. They were farmers from the Midwest who had lost their farms during the Great Depression and migrated west looking for work. They were young women who had been teachers or secretaries or housewives and wanted to contribute to the war effort. They were older men who had worked in factories or construction and saw the shipyards as a way to serve their country even though they were too old to fight. They were Mexican Americans and Asian Americans and Native Americans, people from all the diverse groups that made up American society, working side by side in the common cause of winning the war. The shipyards became melting pots where people who might never have met otherwise worked together. And while tensions and conflicts certainly existed, there was also a sense of shared purpose that transcended the differences. Many of these workers had their lives changed fundamentally by their experience in the shipyards. Women who had never worked outside the home discovered that they were capable of doing demanding physical labor and earning good wages, and many of them never wanted to go back to traditional domestic roles after the war ended. African Americans who had been confined to menial jobs in the segregated South came west and found opportunities to advance and earn respect based on their abilities. And this experience contributed to the civil rights movement that would transform America in the following decades. Young people who had never traveled further than the next county over suddenly found themselves part of a vast industrial enterprise connected to a global war, and their horizons expanded in ways they could never have imagined. The Liberty Ship program changed not just the course of the war but the course of individual lives, leaving ripples that spread far beyond the shipyards and the sea. When we look at Henry Kaiser's achievement from the perspective of the 21st century, it seems almost impossible that such a thing could have happened. In today's world of complex regulations, environmental reviews, safety requirements, and endless legal challenges, building even a single shipyard would take years of planning and approvals, let alone building multiple massive shipyards from scratch and launching thousands of ships in just a few years. We live in a time when major construction projects routinely run years behind schedule and billions of dollars over budget, when building a new airport terminal or highway interchange becomes a decade-long ordeal involving countless stakeholders and interest groups. The idea that one man could decide to revolutionize an entire industry and do it in a matter of months rather than years seems like science fiction to modern audiences. This comparison raises uncomfortable questions about whether we have lost something important in the decades since World War II. Have we become so risk-averse, so focused on avoiding any possibility of failure, that we can no longer accomplish great things quickly? Have our systems and processes become so complicated that they actively prevent the kind of rapid innovation and adaptation that Kaiser exemplified? Or are we simply facing different challenges, building more complex systems that genuinely require more time and care? There are no easy answers to these questions, but they are worth asking, especially as the world faces new challenges that may require rapid mobilization of resources and capabilities in ways that echo the Liberty ship era. At the same time, we should not romanticize the past or forget the costs that came with Kaiser's approach. Workers died in his shipyards at rates that would be considered completely unacceptable today. Ships broke apart at sea because of design flaws and construction defects that better oversight might have caught. The rush to produce ships as quickly as possible sometimes led to corners being cut and safety concerns being ignored. Modern regulations and safety requirements exist for good reasons, written in the blood of people who died because adequate precautions were not taken. The challenge is to find ways to move quickly and accomplish ambitious goals while still protecting workers and ensuring quality, to capture the spirit of innovation and urgency that Kaiser represented without repeating the mistakes and tragedies that came along with his successes. Henry Kaiser's Liberty ship program represented more than just an industrial achievement. It represented a fundamental shift in how wars could be won. Throughout most of human history, wars were won primarily through military skill, superior tactics, better training, or more advanced weapons. The side with the better generals, the more disciplined soldiers, or the more sophisticated technology usually prevailed. But World War II demonstrated that in a modern industrialized conflict, manufacturing capacity could be just as important as battlefield prowess. If one side could produce weapons, ammunition, vehicles, ships, and aircraft faster than the other side could destroy them, that side would eventually win no matter what happened in individual battles. The Germans understood military excellence. Their army was superbly trained and equipped, their officers were skilled, their tactics were innovative. But Germany could not match the industrial output of the United States, especially once America fully mobilized for war. When German U-boat commanders realized that the Allies were building ships faster than they could sink them, they knew the Battle of the Atlantic was lost, even if the fighting continued. When German tank commanders faced endless waves of American Sherman tanks, they might destroy 5 or 10 Shermans for every German tank lost. But the Americans just kept bringing more Shermans while the Germans ran out of tanks. The mathematics of industrial production defeated military excellence, and Kaiser's Liberty ships were a perfect example of this strategic revolution. This lesson has shaped military thinking ever since. Modern militaries worry as much about supply chains and manufacturing capacity as they do about tactics and weapons. The ability to replace losses quickly and keep forces supplied in the field is recognized as fundamental to military success. When analysts assess the military balance between nations, they look not just at how many weapons each side has today, but at how quickly each side could produce more weapons if a conflict began. The Liberty ship program taught the world that in modern warfare, the factory is as important as the battlefield, and the manager who can organize production efficiently is as valuable as the general who can win battles. Henry Kaiser never commanded troops in combat, but his contribution to Allied victory was as significant as that of many celebrated generals and admirals. While most Liberty ships were scrapped or sunk in the decades after World War II, some continued sailing for much longer than anyone expected. These vessels, built in a matter of weeks for what was supposed to be a short service life, proved to be remarkably durable. Some Liberty ships were still carrying cargo into the 1970s and even the 1980s, more than 40 years after they were built, which is an extraordinary lifespan for any merchant ship. They sailed under different flags and different names, owned by shipping companies around the world, carrying cargo to ports that their original builders had probably never heard of. These long-serving Liberty ships proved that Kaiser's rush to build them quickly had not necessarily resulted in poor quality, at least not in all cases. When properly maintained, the basic design was sound enough to last for decades. A few Liberty ships ended up in unexpected roles. Some were converted into technical research vessels, carrying scientists to study the ocean or test new equipment. Others became training ships for merchant marine academies, teaching new generations of sailors their trade. One Liberty ship, the SS Albert M. Bow, was deliberately sunk in 1948 as part of Operation Sandstone, a nuclear weapons test at Enwatack Atoll in the Pacific. The ship survived the initial blast from the atomic bomb, but was so contaminated by radiation that it had to be sunk. This ignominious end for a vessel that had survived the U-boat campaign seemed somehow symbolic of the transition from World War II to the Cold War, from the age of conventional warfare to the nuclear age. The Greek shipping industry bought many Liberty ships after the war and operated them for decades, and these vessels helped Greece rebuild its merchant fleet, which had been devastated during the German occupation. For Greece and other nations that had been destroyed by the war, the cheap and available Liberty ships were a lifeline, allowing them to restart their economies and participate in international trade. In this way, the Liberty ships continued to serve their original purpose, supporting the recovery of the free world, just in peacetime rather than during the war. The ships that had been built to defeat tyranny ended up helping to build peace and prosperity, which is perhaps the best legacy any weapon of war could hope for. One of the sadnesses of the Liberty ship story is how quickly the workers who built the ships were forgotten after the war ended. While soldiers and sailors received parades and medals, and thanks from a grateful nation, the men and women who had worked in the shipyard simply went home and back to their regular lives with little recognition of their crucial contribution. The women who had worked as welders and crane operators found themselves pushed out of these jobs as men returned from military service, expected to go back to being housewives and mothers as if their wartime work had never happened. African American workers who had found opportunities in the shipyards returned to a segregated society that still denied them basic rights and treated them as second-class citizens. For decades, the story of the Liberty ships and the people who built them was largely forgotten, overshadowed by more dramatic stories of combat and heroism. The shipyard workers had not charged enemy machine guns or flown bombing missions over hostile territory, so their contribution seemed less worthy of celebration and remembrance. But gradually, historians and researchers began to recognize the crucial importance of the home front, of the industrial workers who made the military victories possible. Books were written about the Liberty ships and the shipyards, documentaries were produced, and the two surviving Liberty Ship Museum ships became important sites for preserving this history and educating the public. Today, there are efforts to identify and honor the individual workers who built the Liberty ships, to collect their oral histories before the last of them pass away, to ensure that their stories are not lost to time. Museums and historical societies have gathered photographs and documents and personal memories, creating archives that will allow future generations to understand what these people did and why it mattered. The workers themselves, those few who are still alive, are now in their 90s or older, and they often express surprise that anyone is interested in their stories after all these years. But their stories deserve to be told and remembered, because they are part of the larger story of how ordinary people rose to meet an extraordinary challenge and helped save the world from tyranny. When historians and economists look back at the Liberty Ship program, they see an achievement that seems almost miraculous in its scope and success. The program cost approximately $3 billion, which sounds like a lot until you realize that this was less than 1% of America's total spending on World War II. For that relatively modest investment, the nation got thousands of ships that carried millions of tons of cargo, enabled the defeat of Germany and Japan, and helped create the post-war world order that led to decades of unprecedented peace and prosperity among the major powers. By any reasonable standard of measurement, the Liberty Ship program was one of the best investments any nation has ever made. The program also demonstrated the power of American capitalism when properly directed toward a national goal. Henry Kaiser was not a government employee or a bureaucrat, but a private businessman who saw an opportunity and seized it. He made money from building Liberty ships, lots of money, and while some people criticized him as a war profiteer, Kaiser argued that there was nothing wrong with making a profit while serving the nation. The profit motive drove him to be as efficient as possible, to find ways to build ships faster and cheaper, because the more efficiently he could build them, the more money he made. This alignment of private interest with public good, of individual profit with national necessity, was capitalism working exactly as it was supposed to work, and the results spoke for themselves. Yet the program also showed the limits of pure capitalism and the necessary role of government in accomplishing large national goals. Kaiser needed government contracts and government financing to build his shipyards and produce his ships. He needed the government to train workers and provide materials and coordinate the vast logistical enterprise that supported the shipbuilding program. He benefited from government research into shipbuilding techniques and materials. The Liberty Ship program was not an example of either pure capitalism or pure government control, but rather a partnership between the two, with each playing its necessary role. This lesson about the power of public-private partnerships remains relevant today as we face challenges that require both government resources and private sector innovation and efficiency. Henry Kaiser in his later years became something of a mythical figure, the embodiment of American industrial genius and can-do spirit. But the real man was more complicated and more interesting than the legend. Kaiser was driven and ambitious, yes, but he was also capable of genuine kindness and concern for his workers. He was a brilliant innovator but also made significant mistakes and experienced major failures. He was supremely confident in his own abilities but also willing to listen to others and change his mind when convinced by better arguments. He was a product of his time, sharing some of the prejudices and assumptions of American society in the mid-20th century, but also ahead of his time in his willingness to hire women and minorities and treat them with respect. Those who worked closely with Kaiser described him as a force of nature, a man who seemed to have unlimited energy and optimism even in the face of enormous challenges. He would walk through his shipyards talking to workers, asking them about their jobs, listening to their suggestions, making them feel that their contributions mattered. He had a gift for inspiring people, for making them believe they could accomplish things that seemed impossible. But he could also be demanding and impatient, expecting others to work as hard as he did, sometimes pushing people beyond their limits. He was not an easy man to work for, but most people who worked for him respected him and felt that they were part of something important. Kaiser's personal life was marked by both success and tragedy. He was married to his wife Bess for more than 50 years until her death, and by all accounts they had a strong and loving relationship. They had 2 sons, both of whom followed their father into business. Kaiser enjoyed tremendous financial success but also experienced setbacks and losses that would have destroyed lesser men. He had health problems as he aged but refused to slow down, continuing to work and launch new ventures well into his 80s. When he finally died, he left behind a complex legacy, a mix of achievements and failures, innovations and mistakes, a record that defies simple judgments and easy categories. He was, in the end, a deeply human figure whose extraordinary accomplishments should not blind us to his flaws and limitations, just as his flaws should not diminish our appreciation for what he achieved. It is worth considering what might have happened if Henry Kaiser had not revolutionized Liberty ship production, if the Allies had continued building ships the traditional way at the traditional pace. The mathematics are sobering. In 1942, German U-boats were sinking Allied ships faster than they could be replaced, and this trend was accelerating. If this had continued, Britain would have faced starvation by 1943 or 1944, with food supplies running out and industrial production grinding to a halt for lack of raw materials. Churchill might have been forced to negotiate some kind of peace with Germany, or Britain might have simply collapsed, unable to continue fighting. Even if Britain had somehow held on, the invasion of France would have been impossible without the vast fleet of ships needed to transport and supply the invasion forces. In the Pacific, the war against Japan depended entirely on American ability to project power across thousands of miles of ocean. And that projection required ships, endless ships, to carry troops and supplies and equipment to remote islands and hostile shores. Without the Liberty ships, the island hopping campaign would have stalled, Japanese forces would have had time to dig in and strengthen their defenses, and the war would have dragged on for years longer than it did. Some historians estimate that without the accelerated shipbuilding program, World War II might have continued until 1946 or even 1947, with millions more people dying in the extended conflict. The atomic bombs might have been used more extensively, not just on Hiroshima and Nagasaki but on other Japanese cities as well, simply because conventional invasion would have been impossible without adequate shipping. This alternate history is, of course, speculative, but it helps us understand just how important the Liberty ship program really was. Kaiser's contribution to victory was not just about building ships faster. It was about making victory possible at all, and making it possible years sooner than it otherwise would have been. Every month that the war ended earlier meant thousands of lives saved, cities and towns that were not destroyed, families that were not torn apart. The true measure of Kaiser's achievement is not just in the ships he built but in the suffering he prevented, the lives he saved, and the better future he helped create. The Liberty ship program represented the peak of American industrial dominance, a moment when the United States could outproduce the rest of the world combined, when American factories and shipyards operated at a scale and efficiency that seemed almost superhuman. That era did not last. After World War II, other nations rebuilt their industries, and by the 1970s and 1980s, American manufacturing was facing intense competition from Japan, Germany, and other countries that had learned from American methods and in some cases surpassed them. The shipbuilding industry largely moved overseas where labor costs were lower, and today very few ships are built in American shipyards. The massive industrial infrastructure that Kaiser and others built during the war has largely disappeared, replaced by a service-based economy focused on technology and finance rather than manufacturing. Some people view this transformation with nostalgia, longing for the days when America made things, when factory jobs provided good middle-class livings, when the nation's economic strength was based on producing physical goods rather than moving money and information around. Others see the shift to a post-industrial economy as inevitable and even desirable, arguing that high-value services and advanced technology provide better opportunities than manufacturing ever could. But regardless of how one judges these changes, there is no question that something has been lost. The ability to rapidly mobilize industrial production on the scale that Kaiser demonstrated during World War II no longer exists in America. And if a similar crisis arose today, it is not clear that the nation could respond with the same speed and effectiveness. This loss of manufacturing capacity has national security implications that military planners worry about. If America became involved in a major war today, could the nation build weapons and equipment fast enough to replace combat losses? Do we still have the industrial base and the skilled workforce to ramp up production quickly? Or have we become too dependent on global supply chains and overseas manufacturing, leaving us vulnerable if those sources were cut off? These questions have no easy answers, but they are worth thinking about as we remember what Henry Kaiser and his workers accomplished more than 80 years ago. The Liberty Ship program showed what America could do when threatened, but it also required an industrial capability that may no longer exist in the same way today. The story of how one shipyard manager made Liberty ships appear faster than Germany could sink them is ultimately a story about human potential and what people can accomplish when they refuse to accept limitations. Henry Kaiser was not superhuman. He did not have magic powers or special knowledge that others lacked. What he had was an absolute refusal to believe that something was impossible just because it had never been done before. When experts told him that ships could not be mass-produced like automobiles, he simply did not accept that judgment and proved them wrong. When traditional shipbuilders said his methods would not work, he showed them that traditional methods were not the only way to build ships. When everyone said a task was too difficult or too complex or too ambitious, Kaiser took that as a challenge rather than as a barrier. Kaiser succeeded because he understood that most limitations are not real but are simply assumptions that people have accepted without questioning. He looked at shipbuilding with fresh eyes, without the burden of knowing how things had always been done, and that ignorance was actually an advantage rather than a disadvantage. He was willing to try new methods, to make mistakes and learn from them, to adapt and change his approach when something did not work. He created an environment where innovation was encouraged, and failure was treated as a learning opportunity rather than as a career-ending disaster. Most importantly, he believed in the people who worked for him, trusting that ordinary men and women could do extraordinary things if given the chance and the proper support. The Liberty ships themselves have mostly disappeared, cut up for scrap or resting on the bottom of the ocean, but the lessons they taught remain as relevant as ever. We live in a time of enormous challenges, from climate change to pandemics to geopolitical tensions, and these challenges often seem overwhelming and impossible to solve. The story of Henry Kaiser and the Liberty ships reminds us that impossible is just a word, that human ingenuity and determination can overcome obstacles that seem insurmountable, and that ordinary people working together can achieve things that no individual could accomplish alone. When we face problems that seem too big to solve, when experts tell us that change is impossible, when conventional wisdom says that things cannot be done differently, we should remember the Liberty ships and the man who refused to accept that building ships faster than Germany could sink them was impossible. He proved it could be done, and in doing so, he helped save the world.